for BBC television in 1958.
Coming? All right. What would you have done?
Sun shines all the time. It's absolutely marvellous place to come.
It was on this tour that I discovered my lasting enthusiasm for islands.
Don't you take your own shoes off?
Of course I don't take my own shoes off. I haven't taken my own shoes off for 45 years.
Very well.
Very primitive.
Yes, could say that.
My travels for television started back in the 50s. We set out from what was then known as London Airport with nothing much planned, merely to explore whatever looked interesting. That wasn't hard, because it was all new and exciting. I don't go along with the flying pill poppers who want to sleep all the way there and back. If you're writing the grammar of travel television, you can't afford to miss a minute, let alone a second glass of champagne.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
Whereabouts are you flying to
Hong
today?
Kong. When I started, a flight to the Far East was a major adventure.
There's your boarding card, sir. You have a safe flight.
Thank you. For most of my travelling life, as a man already set in his airways, this, Heathrow, was where we had takeoff. It was normally about 4 bumpy days to Tokyo and Korea. We travelled in one of VOAC's noisy Canadian Argonauts at 15,000 feet and a respectable 250 miles an hour. It was like a long sea voyage. Romances and enmities flourished, and by the time we reached Japan, we were all jolly members of an intrepid flying club.
We are approaching the station. Please hold on. This stop for B gates.
And some of us, I might add, were engaged.
Hello. This is the busiest street of the largest city in the world, the Ginza in Tokyo. Well, I've had 8 courses tonight, and each one of them was fish. I've got the chopsticks to prove it.
Somewhere waiting for me.
When Whicker's World began turning on television 50 years ago, such travel was still an unattainable dream for most people. But by then, cameras had already become the best way to show viewers what was going on around the world. Travel and television seemed meant for each other. This week, I'm returning to Hong Kong, now a mere 13 hours from London. It's hard to see this floating Manhattan as an island, yet Hong Kong remains one of the sights of the world. I first came here in 1951 when I was on my way to Korea as a war correspondent, and planes then stopped 10 times from London to Tokyo, and so it could be refueled. We all came into town, into the peninsula, and had dinner. And I got my first glimpse of this place, and I thought, this is somewhere that I must get to know. It was so wonderful to start with, and it's remained wonderful ever since. I've always felt at home in the former colony. It's a cosmopolitan island that's always welcomed travellers, adventurers, and generations of foreign correspondents arriving to cover Asia's triumphs and disasters. I returned many times to this oriental crossroads on the way to everywhere. First, when still in Fleet Street, working for the Extel news agency and covering most of the wars then going, like Korea. As a bachelor willing to work unpopular hours like Christmas Day, I was usually selected for the more dramatic assignments. Not because of any particular talent, I suspected, but because a bachelor's insurance premiums were far less costly. I then carried my fascination with travel from Fleet Street over to Lime Grove to the Tonight Show as it spread its wings, and then on to Whicker's World. In July '58, I set off with a crew of 2 on my first television world tour, returning at the end of October after 30,000 miles and some 50 reports from 6 different countries. I instantly became Tonight's man around the world. Why, I even worked on Christmas Day without noticing.
Hello. One of the more frightening things that can happen to a man in the Far East is to land at Hong Kong Airport. The runways of the present Hong Kong Airport are crouched up against the side of the mountains, and to come in, the plane flies down a ravine with its wing tips almost touching the mountain tops, turns right at the bottom and left, and altogether it's a very alarming experience. There's one just landing down there, perhaps you can see it. It's not the kind of thing that a traveller enjoys, at any rate. And coming in from Bangkok the other day, the captain of the aircraft came back into the passenger cabin, and I confessed that the last few miles of the flight to Hong Kong, I always shut my eyes. And the captain said, well, as a matter of fact, old chap, so do I.
Hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, Yakasaki wants some seafood, mama.
These reports were the first to appear under the series titled of Whicker's World.
But the majority of Hong Kong's newcomers don't arrive by air. They come streaming across the border from communist China at the rate of 1,000 a week, and they settle here in Hong Kong's shanty towns. I'm on board a Hong Kong police launch, a 20-knot launch, one of those that set out every night looking for junks, Chinese junks that are bringing to the colony some of the 1,000 illegal immigrants who it's estimated arrive each week. This is the time of night when 100 upon 100 of junks set out. And this one stops. They don't always stop. This is what's happening in the waters around Hong Kong. All night and every night. For this one, it is quite clean. And yet, despite this nightly vigilance, despite these swift motorboats with their searchlights and their radar, refugees are getting through all the time. Every morning, the population of the shanty towns is larger than the day before.
Upon our arrival in Hong Kong, we've been offered the splendid penthouse of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank atop its skyscraper. And that's it, that little bungalow down there in light stone. It was then all of 10 stories high. Later it was rebuilt, this time a more adequate 41 stories. Returning sweaty and weary after filming in squalid squatters' camps, impeccable Chinese servants, the bank's servants, would greet us with an unaccustomed sherry wine, sir. The bank was the third arm of the Trident which ruled the colony alongside the Governor-General and Jardine Matheson Hong. Its managing director, Michael Turner, was a leading member of the Legislative Council and a very grand taipan indeed. In the colony, he was a sort of democratic emperor. Years later, I stopped for petrol in Surrey, and the attendant, noting my colony-bought Humber, told me some chap called Turner lived around the corner. Used to be a bank clerk in Hong Kong, he said. We are all demoted by retirement. One of my reports seemed about to start World War III. I've been an international incident on many occasions, but it's never much fun. Thank you. To get aerial shots of the colony, I'd arranged with the ever-helpful RAF a flight in an Oster of the Auxiliary Air Force. The pilot of our small spotter plane was perhaps over-enthused by my eager cameraman, who flew low along the border. Then, for the very first time, Chinese anti-aircraft guns opened fire upon the West. It was the moment citizens had been dreading, and we were not overjoyed either. Observing we were unwelcome, my startled pilot hastily zigzagged back to Hong Kong Airport at 0 feet, feeling as though Biggles had just escaped the Red Baron. We faced a panic-stricken colony which was living in fear of just such a Chinese avalanche. The government huffily impounded our film. We had rocked the boat and were extremely unpopular. Peking was officially assured that our fluttery little Oster was not the spearhead of a mighty invasion to free the mainland. Breathing deeply, we flew off to Tokyo before minds could be changed or we were hit by second thoughts. Having come a little too close to Chinese anti-aircraft fire in Hong Kong, we moved on to look at the more peaceful Chinese way of death in Singapore.
This is the Street of Death in Singapore's Chinatown. This is where the Chinese, who make up about 80% of Singapore's 1.5 million population, come to prepare for death, to die, to be mourned, and finally to be driven away for burial in gaily painted lorries. Now, just as cobblers gather in one street and tailors in another, so do the traders in death gather here in Sago Lane.
Most of these old people, they come from very crowded homes, and you know, Chinese are very superstitious about death, and they don't like people dying in the homes.
So they put them out into a place like this, which is in the street of mortuaries.
Yes.
And they wait to die, and then they're carried downstairs and put in a coffin.
Yes, that's right.
Now, there's a lot of music and noise in the street here. What is this?
It's a funeral.
So these old people lie here listening day to day to funerals?
Yes. Some of them have been here for years.
Waiting for death?
Yes.
Everyone is invited to every Chinese funeral. For the more mourners who follow the coffin, and the noisier their traipse around the cemetery, the greater the honour to the departed. Sago Lane lost its character and its mortuaries in the 80s and closed. The dying must go elsewhere. When Whicker's World returned to the Far East for a 1972 series, we visited Hong Kong again to look at the many Chinese who were still trying to escape to the colony. Some of them were even attempting to swim for freedom. The story took me to the only place in Hong Kong then under the control of the Chinese Communist government. There's one place right in the heart of this colony that not only the freedom swimmers but the police avoid, and this is it, the walled city of Kowloon. 6 acres of festering slum with 20,000 people who so far have refused resettlement because they regard it as a piece of China, a piece of the mainland. This is a sort of Far Eastern Casbah where children are tied to stone ledges to prevent them falling into the open sewers. It's a place of excretia and rats, of violence, of brothels, of heroin divans, as they're called, of every sort of viciousness and villainy. And if it's a place that the police have refused to come into, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. Shortly after filming this piece to camera, the triads made it plain that we were no longer welcome in their walled city. Seemed pointless to argue. By 1990, Hong Kong had become rich. But the handover to China grew ever closer. The walled city was little changed, still a dreadful and sordid slum, though one Englishwoman was attempting to make a difference. Something's happening to the most vicious, most helpless of the lost people of the walled city, the drug addicts. They're seeking salvation under the determined guidance of a woman from Sutton who arrived in Hong Kong 23 years ago to hand out tracts and survived by teaching the piano. Today, Jackie Pullinger is to them a sort of saviour.
When I first went to Walled City, in those days they were actually piling bodies up by the single loo, and those were people who'd OD'd in the night. So I started by trying, it was almost like attacking actually, the people who guarded the gambling dens. We did it swinging around about 2 a.m. And I went up to one, and said, "Jesus loves you," and I really thought it would change his life. Of course, he wasn't at all impressed. He just said, "Run along, go find another victim." I mean, in the beginning, obviously, when I was beginning in the streets, I used to go and find people. But now they come running after us. Usually it happens when somebody's met someone down a street, an old friend, and they see he's fat. And they're very impressed by fat people because when you're on drugs, you don't eat. You don't have money and you don't have appetite. So they usually say something like, "Dingani Gumfei, why are you so fat?" And the fat one says, "It's Jesus." And they say, okay, I'll have him. And where can I find him? And the fat one will say, "He's in the Walled City on Wednesdays and Saturdays." I mean, this is really how it happens.
Great.
So they come in knowing nothing.
Love it.
But Jesus changed their friend. They say, "Okay, now where is he?"
Jesus makes you fat.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And they were free.
The walled city was finally knocked down without much civil ceremony in 1991. This frenetic, unsentimental place offered some of Hong Kong's more expensive real estate. Yet surprisingly, the walled city was not developed and instead was transformed into a botanical garden. This was uncharacteristic, but welcome. I'm here to meet Jackie Pullinger again. She's continued to work among the city's drug addicts, and her dedication and work over 40 years has seen her name set in stone.
Well, they tore the walled city down.
Yes.
They made this beautiful garden, and then I discovered they'd named a rock after me, which is signifying some of the things that happened in the walled city with the old gangsters and how they changed.
And that you were as tough as they were. And much,
That's not what it says.
And much holier.
Yes, full of holes.
Now, they pulled down the walled city and the frightful inhabitants dispersed. Where did they go? What did they do? What happened to them?
Well, everybody who rented something was given the opportunity to rent like a council house. Then you were given money compensation. But I knew a lot of drug addicts who got their money and then spent it all on drugs. So they ended up with no home and no money.
What about the triads then?
Well, many of the triads just came in to do gang activities or sell drugs or take drugs or run gambling things or brothels. And they continue to do that everywhere else in Hong Kong, but more out of sight. And I've got two people here who were old triad members, and they say, "Oh, it's not like it was. We don't have the old big gang bosses and the initiation ceremonies, a bit like the mafia families. It's not the same as it was. Nobody plays by the same rules as they used to."
Now, the communists have never been very kind about Christians, have they? No? They don't give you an easy time. How have you been affected?
Honestly, with the communists or the British government, it makes no difference. Everybody's thrilled if they see somebody changed. We've many times across the border helped people get off drugs in the same way we do here, and they love it. They just don't know what to do because we're not supposed to be there. So they say, "Move." because you're not supposed to exist. But individuals say, well, we see what you're doing, and we see people are changing. So I think the individual is always touched, but the officialdom doesn't know what to do with us.
Now, does Jesus still make you fat?
You can see.
Hong Kong's transformation is reflected in its skyline, from the shanty towns and bazaars of my first visit to the modern peaks of today. Fast-moving and overpopulated, it's a place where taxi drivers keep a beady eye on the stock market and worry about the price of gold. This resilient, materialistic society changes little, but a decade ago, no one knew what the handover might bring. On my last visit to Hong Kong, I stood on this roof as fireworks lit up the harbour, rain poured down, and we prepared to say goodbye. After handover ceremonies with Prince Charles, the governor, Chris Patten, wept as he boarded Britannia. It was the end of an era, and the last significant speck of empire disappeared beneath those dark waters. Hong Kong has always been a favourite stopover, but it wasn't until my first trip down under in 1960 that I caught an incurable case of islanditis.
This is Norfolk Island, where the descendants of Fletcher Christian and the mutineers of the Bounty, those defiant British seamen and their Tahitian wives, came to live in peace.
Road tax is £6 a year, but if you can't afford it, you can do a week's work on the roads instead. Electricity has just arrived, and there are even 1 or 2 telephones.
Now, you came out here to Norfolk Island to retire, what, a couple of years ago. Why Norfolk?
Well, Norfolk is a peaceful, nice place where you can live a quiet life. And we live under the benevolence of the Australian government, who give us £32,000 a year as a grant to the island. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Great Britain doesn't charge us any income tax on our incomes over there. And so we live pretty well tax-free. And the only rates on the island are £10 a year. The sun shines all the time. It's absolutely a marvellous place to come.
A marvellous place to come. If you don't ask more from life than peace and sunshine, yes, perhaps you ought to join the 1,000 or so islanders who bask in both all the year round on these fortunate 15 square miles.
The mutineers' leader had been Captain Bligh's mate, Fletcher Christian. Almost the whole population of Norfolk Island shared 8 surnames. On my first visit there were still 24 families of Christians, 12 of Adams, 27 of Quintals, in an island of a couple of thousand inhabitants. My favourite was Girly Christian.
Your great-grandfather came here from Pitcairn. Was it your great-grandfather?
No, my grandfather.
Oh, your grandfather?
Yes.
Well, now, his grandfather was Fletcher Christian.
Fletcher Christian, the real Fletcher Christian.
Okay, what sort of a man do you think he was?
Well, of course, I would say he was a good man.
Although he was perhaps a violent man.
I don't know that. I wasn't there.
The first invasion of remote Norfolk had been caused by the need for a secure penal settlement for 19th century hard cases. The second came when the Bounty descendants outgrew Pitcairn and needed a new home. The third invasion was caused, they said, by me. My Tonight reports had been transmitted in Britain on some miserable November nights, and on the strength of my enthusiasm for this subtropical speck, some 50 viewers sold their homes and travelled across the world to start a new life on an island they'd never heard of, deep in the South Pacific. As I flew into Norfolk on my second visit a few years later, it occurred to me that if those 50 British families were miserable in their new home and much preferred Salford, then I was in trouble.
Now, had I exaggerated or overstated or understated?
Oh, understated, if anything.
Really?
Because we thought it was a paradise when we first arrived here, and we still think so.
I need not have worried. Television, normally blamed for everything bad from violence to dandruff, had done something right. They were happy as mutineers in their lovely tax-free oasis. I caught up with Girlie again. She had 86 acres, so was an island catch, but had never married. She just lost a leg in a riding accident when her horse fell and rolled over her.
I said, Doc, before I go under, sew my leg on again so I can go to the ballrooms. I said, I'm well and ugly, but still I like the ballrooms. They suit me good. They're beautiful.
You've never been married, of course, Girlie, have you?
True, nobody would have me. They're shy clear of me, boy.
Perhaps they don't know how much land you've got, you see.
The land doesn't count in this case, neither does money.
Girlie described everything as beautiful and only herself as ugly. This was not so. She was wonderful.
Girlie, let's talk about Norfolk a little bit. You've seen a lot of changes. Do you think they're good changes now? Are you pleased with the way the island's going, or are you sorry?
Beautiful. Nothing spoiled.
Good.
Everything's more marvelous every day.
Years later, in 1979, I called her from New Zealand, only to find that this indomitable lady had gone to join her defiant ancestors. Much of my life has been divided between unspoiled paradise isles and white men's graves. I was always landing with my cameras on virgin beaches, unprotected by background music, and pushing on through primeval jungles, and, whatever television says, the far-flung can be horrid. Given the chance, I much prefer my paradises ever so slightly spoiled. There's a strong argument for the well-beaten. Travel agents trail unspoiled like some hypnotic blandishment. In one mighty bound, you can get not only ahead of the Joneses, but so far away from them they won't even be able to find you. So you can write your own blurb and tell your own stories uncontradicted. So what do they mean by that magic word? No roads or beds, yak milk, do-it-yourself dentistry, one stream for drinking, washing and lavatory. His unspoiled is your nightmare, is my forget it. For most undiscovered paradises on the Whicker's world flight path have, upon close examination, offered dysentery, dengue fever, rancid meat, filaria, sharks, intestinal bacteria, and water that wriggles.
What a world, what a life, I'm in love.
One of those South Pacific paradises you dream about.
The song that I sing, I can make the rain go anytime I move my finger.
But Whicker's world allowed me to explore places most people had never heard of.
The volcanic outer island of Tanna.
Beautiful.
You don't get weary with a brief like that.
As long as I hold the string, I'd be a silly so-and-so if I should ever let it go. I got the world on a string.
It's a free and easy life here. You don't have to get dressed up, so to speak.
You often travelled incognito. I wondered how you managed to do that.
I'm in love.
We're all searching for a better life somewhere.
Unfortunately, along the way, some very odd people have tried to follow in my footsteps. Nauru was a tiny island with more money than it knew what to do with. Its vast fortune was based exclusively on fossilized bird droppings.
The smallest, loneliest, richest republic in the world. a sweltering speck just south of the equator, lost in the immensity of the Pacific, 2,500 miles from Tokyo and Sydney and Hawaii, as isolated as it's possible to be. Nauru is no paradise isle, no fruit, no fresh water, few fish. Its people live in dusty isolation upon their 5,000 acres amid this lunar landscape, stark and unreal. Yet theirs is the most unusual concentration of wealth in the world. For every coral pinnacle down there commemorates the rise to riches of a handful of Polynesians.
And this is their gold. This is high-grade phosphate, which has fertilized the fields of the world, from the outback of Australia to Japan to England. And just as it has enriched our farms and our farmers, so it's enriched the citizens of this tiny republic to such a degree that they are now richer than the Kuwaitis or the Americans. They're certainly Pacific plutocrats.
Schools and hospitals are free, and so are telephones. Houses cost a token £2 a month, and a free pension awaits. There are no poor. Take your average Nauruan lorry driver. Lorenzo Paul earns £15 a week behind the wheel. But the phosphate company's starting to work his land, so he's preparing to be a dollar millionaire. With the population of an English village, the Nauruans also have their own airline. And they don't fly some tired old DC-3. Theirs is a spanking new £2 million fellowship jet, keeping open the lifeline with Australia. Each quarter day, landowners pick up their 4 or 5-figure royalty checks. It's all many Nauruans have to do. On this improbable isle, every man, woman and child said to be worth £35,000. For the island's annual phosphate income's about £12 million. They've grown almost scornful of such regular dividends.
Only 2,000. Only 2,639. You only get one of these, do you? Just one. What are you going to spend it on?
Get some speedboat.
Get a speedboat?
Yeah.
Even though the Nauruans knew their resource would only last another generation, they were having far too much fun today to worry about tomorrow.
You might not expect such a Western craze to rumble into the peaceful South Pacific, and certainly these 100-mile-an-hour monsters seem a bit pointless here, since the only road brings them right back where they started within a few minutes. But money and time must be spent somehow.
Now, do you ever have any rumbles here? Trouble with the other gangs?
Sometimes they want to have a fight with us to see which gang is stronger, so we give them the request.
A fight?
Yeah.
You've got some very big fellas, I can see that, but I didn't think that Nauruans were very violent. I thought you didn't fight.
It depends on how many beers they drink.
But listen, all this talk, you're a policeman.
Yeah, but I'm half policeman and half Hells Angels, as we might say.
$908, that's £450. $908 twice, that's £900. What's she going to spend the summer?
The lady says she's going to buy something new to her in her life. She haven't had a motorcycle before, and she haven't had a car, and also she haven't had a washing machine. And that's how she's going to spend all this money on.
She doesn't look like a ton-up kid to me.
To the public.
This is what's known as laughing all the way to the bank.
Sure enough, by the early 90s, the phosphates were running out, causing the economy to collapse. In one mighty gamble, the Nauruans invested their last £2 million in Leonardo, a West End musical. It closed soon after the first night reviews came out. For several years, Nauru was paid to house Australia's illegal immigrants. But now that arrangement has ended, and the islanders are broke.
It says that's an island, though, or at least it's a rocky.
This doesn't show as many islands as...
The cruisers arrive at the morning of the world.
Indonesia has well over 13,000 islands. Most are delightful, particularly Nias, little known to the rest of the world until the last devastating tsunami. Exotic cruises have opened up a hidden world to tourists who want their adventure to be comfortable. We joined a shipload gingerly dipping a toe into the third world. Nias had been cut off from the rest of the world with its own language, culture and mythology until, in the late 70s, it became part of the itinerary of a luxury cruise liner.
The shipping company had to make this road, 6 miles uphill, to provide an expedition out of the ordinary. And to think, the Niha built villages high as a defense against invasion. The 4th flight of a great stone staircase leading up from the sea. The last 82 of 700 steps, and in this stunning heat, quite a climb. Some woman's just had a heart attack on these steps.
Oh my, did she really?
Yeah, she was one of the Belgians.
Oh my God, what?
Apparently she had a dicky heart anyway, and her husband brought her on this. And
Oh no.
now look at this sight, isn't that marvelous? The hilltop home of a megalithic culture. 2 rows of pile houses, each a stately black terrace. The more important the owner, the higher the roof. The house of the chief, believed to be divine, took many years to build.
This was one of the most stunning man-made settings I'd ever seen.
The Niha are tiny but ferocious. Once they were headhunters, fiercely resisting outsiders. They weren't brought under Dutch law until the beginning of this century, and even today it's whispered some practice headhunting and human sacrifice.
For the barefoot warriors, stone jumping was a symbol of virility. Once, this was how they scaled enemy walls.
How much?
40,000.
40,000.
14. 14.
Okay, here we go again. 14. $34.14.
I'll tell you what. Take it or leave it.
For 10 you got a deal.
10,000. 10,000. 10,000.
Yeah, for 10 you got a deal.
No more. That's it. 10,000. Okay.
Yeah, I told you got a deal.
All right.
Niha warriors wear stiff black jackets and helmets of crocodile or carabao skin decorated with black hair. Some make themselves even more fearsome by wearing metal moustaches. Well, let's face it, a moustache can be pretty frightening. I'm asking your husband what he makes of it, what he thinks of it.
Very primitive.
Very what?
Very primitive.
Yes, could say that.
The next leg of my journey brings me back to another Indonesian island, which I first visited in the early 70s. Bali, at that time, was on the brink of a tourist revolution, and I thought it was possibly the last paradise. Since then, 2 terrorist bombs have made it a place that we are officially warned not to visit.
I just don't believe what happened here tonight. Everything has gone. The whole street. Ground zero.
The explosion created an unstoppable fireball that leapt from street to street. Hundreds of people, mainly tourists, had crammed into the Sari nightclub and neighboring bars. This was a Saturday night massacre no one here will ever forget.
Some places in the world call you back time after time. Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, Venice, of course, Norfolk Island that nobody's heard of, and now poor, battered Bali. Yet, en route from anywhere, I still always hope to find an excuse to divert to Denpasar Airport, to absorb some more tranquility, to breathe in its peace, to listen to the Gamna again.
Everything you ever heard about Bali is true. For a start, it's perfect. Unique among the dream-away places of the world, Bali's a lilting pageant of temples and festivals, a soft shimmer of sound. The island's one huge botanical garden pervaded by a sort of enchantment.
where copper-skinned Balinese drift through their improbable Never Never Land. Not just a magic isle, but a feeling, an experience. In an area notorious for disaster, famine and revolution, Bali's the ornament of tropical Asia, despite some natural ferocity. Smaller than Lincolnshire, a third the size of Yorkshire, it's only 80 miles by 50, the kind of place that could disappear before your very eyes.
Before air travel, Bali was a symbol of unattainable and distant romance. A few rich travellers arrived on cargo ships. Somerset Maugham and Noel Coward slipped in to be amusing or caustic. In the 60s, hippies on their way to Australia tapped into the spiritualism of the place. Later, tourists and surfers began to descend, though the Balinese sensibly corralled them into one small peninsula where they didn't contaminate the island's beating heart. Those terraced paddy fields, the temples and villages where traditions remain intact. For Westerners who came to look but then couldn't tear themselves away, Bali was an extraordinary experience, a fairy tale, a magic door onto a secret life. I was off to meet Walter Folle, an artist from Dusseldorf who, on his way to Australia, met and married Made, a 13-year-old, thought to be the most beautiful girl on the island.
All right, what would you have done? By the time I reached the village compound where he lives with his wife and her family, it was almost nightfall.
Made was pregnant.
Will your wife have her baby here?
Yes.
Or will you try and get her to a clinic?
Well, you walk up this way, you know how difficult it is, and especially during the day, and we're in the monsoon time, the big rain arrived, and we're expecting the baby any time, so we probably won't make it. The baby probably will be born in this Bali. It's the little Balinese house.
Walter Folle, 33 and a Lutheran, now lives like any low-caste Balinese.
The magic was too much for me, you know, I just... could you say I freaked out, but it was a nice freak, and it was beautiful. I never experienced in my life before. I met my wife, and she was running a little warung. It's a little bamboo hut with her mother, selling kacang.
Nuts.
Peanuts, yeah. So we kept on talking, but what's pure friendship kept going. Maybe on her side a bit of a business too. A white man comes and sits every morning having his coffee and orange juice there, and well, it was nice at the time, very simple, and never dreamed of. Slowly it developed in something else. I had this idea, I said, God, yes.
In Balinese culture, such a marriage was not then considered unusual, though this union ended in divorce 7 years later. Well, I thought it was a bit of a shock for me that he could, that he would marry a girl of 13. I thought that might be a risk.
Yeah, or maybe that I'm married maybe a bit young with him. And
a
then,
bit young, you were 13.
Then I'm becoming a bit older, maybe my thing is already different, I don't know also, you know.
Yeah.
We are human beings, I don't know.
Now, what about your children? If you had children, would you be happy if they got married at that age?
Yeah, both my children already married.
Made's daughter Ratna was born the day after my sudden interview with Walter. 35 years later, she runs a successful batik business in Bali and idolizes her father, who died in 2004.
I do feel I'm a bit lost because I lost my dad. I don't have that family now with me. I do feel lost. Half of my blood is German blood, and then half is Balinese blood. To be in the middle, it's just really hard for me. I do have two different cultures in my blood. but I grew up here.
So how difficult is it now to live and work in Bali?
It's pretty difficult because we have Bali bombing, the first one and then the second one. We've been suffering a lot. We've been suffering.
Are you frightened now? Are you fearful that more could happen?
Well, in one way, I do afraid if that happen again. Afraid for everyone here, for everybody that's here. And how come somebody do that?
Bali is good for the soul, yet now it's been bombed into paradise lost. Among the 202 dead and 209 injured were 88 Australians and 24 Brits. They died outside Paddy's pub. How could this happen in such a place where a baby's feet must never touch the ground, where there is communal commitment to caring and sharing? The outrage tore the spirit out of this particular paradise and destroyed a heart of goodness, wonder and joy. When I first visited Bali, there was one tourist hotel built with Japanese war reparations. Now it has some of the most luxurious accommodation in the world. John O'Sullivan, poet and artist, runs 2 of the island's beautiful resorts. What was the main effect of the bombs on Bali?
I think initially it was quite immense, both from a business point of view, but more importantly for the people of Bali to just try and figure out how someone bombed heaven. And the most important part was also the healing process which people had to go through. Why was the island of the gods the place chosen for this hell?
It never seems the healing is hard to reach, I would have thought, on a terrible crime like that.
It's interesting is that the first thing that the Balinese did after the bombings was not to look for blame, but to look for healing and to look for reason. So the first thing that they did was that the Hindu elders contacted the Islamic elders and said, we have to meet. Why and what have we done wrong for this to have happened on our island, as opposed to you did this, you did that? And that's the joy and that's the beauty of Bali, of where the fact is that there is no blame, there's only a desire to actually elevate. They don't really understand the idea of an eye for an eye, thankfully.
So it would appear.
But also time doth heal all evils, and you have a situation 30 months on of where Bali has very much come back into favour. Why? Because people do not want to be kept out of heaven on earth. And so therefore if they have access and they're allowed to come back, they want to come back. So the level of soul solidarity that there is for Bali is absolutely immense. And that has been from immediately after the last event, is that we had people coming back 1 week later saying is that we just want you to know is that we love Bali, we support Bali, and we are here to give that level of solidarity. So, you know, you can delay paradise, you can't deny it.
That old fantasy about living on a desert island is, of course, a wild dream. To be stranded in the middle of nowhere without communications, medicine, electricity, everything we take for granted, is no paradise. But one couple from Hampshire chose to live that Robinson Crusoe life on 3 Hummock Island, a tiny dot in the ocean between Australia and Tasmania. Having survived the cruelties and deprivation of wartime Europe, their plan was to insulate themselves from the bleak uncertainties of the Cold War and to be self-sufficient. From here, John and Eleanor Alliston launched into the world 4 children and 14 grandchildren. Isolation meant the most basic of living conditions, sporadic contact with the rest of the world, and a struggle to survive. In many ways, their philosophy was ahead of their time. They recycled, they wasted nothing, they deplored additives, and they left nothing behind save a few footprints in the island sand and a memory of their happiness.
Had you any idea when you left England what you were getting yourself into?
No, no idea whatsoever. When I walked into this house, of course it's all, with women it's always the house, isn't it? John saw the beautiful land and the trees and the paddocks and the stock and thought that was absolute bliss, and I thought the house was hell, complete hell.
And you've been here 36 years and you haven't changed a thing.
Well, I beg your pardon, but our beautiful pine-encrusted sitting room and lovely little kitchen, I don't think you've ventured in there yet. What we didn't realise was that if we didn't do it ourselves, nobody is going to ever come and do it for us. I used to be a fearful, I wanted things exactly the way I wanted them. I made them happen. Well, now, it's absolutely too easy. It's like falling off a log. It's just wonderful.
Is there anything in the world that you want now?
Something frightfully extravagant. One great, big, square-cut emerald ring to add to my rather small collection.
But surely, arriving to Farman Island at the bottom of the world must have been one mighty bound for an English naval officer from Regent's Park, NW1.
There does come a time in your life when you have to take a sharp knife and chop everything away and start again. And that's exactly what we did.
So you dreamed of an island, John, but had you planned how you were going to cope when you got here?
No, we hadn't. And we got some nasty surprises.
Like what?
Well, for instance, I found that I had, in order to live, I had to be able to slaughter a sheep and dress it and somehow keep it and feed the kids with it.
You don't do that very often in the Navy.
I did. I'm right, you are.
After all these years and all this work, what impact have you had on the island?
Very little. Very little. The island's much bigger than we are. And the little bit of ploughing and clearing and fencing we've done can disappear in 10 years. You'd know no one had been here. And I'm delighted with that.
Yes.
It really shows me that this island is bigger than all us chaps who come along and fiddle around with tractors and spades and things. It's far stronger.
Far from being dour and lonely, they were charming and upbeat. Healthy and active, they shared a youthful optimism that belied their years. They had chosen to live a life which had more in common with the 19th century than the 20th, but their contentment was such that they were probably the happiest couple I have filmed.
Have you not now, having lived together in this solitary way for 36 years?
Yes.
Have you not said everything there is to say to each other?
No, that's the biggest fallacy in the world. That's a lovely question. I think that we're always covering new ground. It's absolutely amazing. It's the most amazing experience to know some other person well.
Eleanor was 75, but still a determined dreamer with a practical outlook. Each day she moved barefooted around the island, dictating into a recorder her romantic novels, which told of girls called Tiffany in passionate conflict with men known as Rhett in some dashing city of the mind. To me, such everyday fiction seems far less romantic than the true love story of Eleanor and John on their deserted island.
Suddenly she heard the familiar thundering footsteps on the stairs, and a look of terror crossed her face.
Down in the courtyard, the caterers and the florists and the bands, she heard them all again and realised that this was her wedding day. The end of that.
Can you foresee the day when you'll leave 300?
Only when I'm dead. But even then I won't leave it, because John absolutely guarantees he'll put me on the compost heap so that he can grow some lovely tomatoes out of me.
I thought you were going to say you'd be buried in a lovely little grave under that beautiful tree.
No, because it's too much nuisance for people to look after. I'd rather be absolutely vanish into the atmosphere, I think. I've got no thought of it. If I die, fine. If I don't, fine. And sometimes when we're in an aircraft and the engine splutters and things like that, I think, isn't it glorious that John and he won't have to find out how to turn on the toaster, because here we go, both together, what fun. And I've got a lovely little speech ready of thank yous to him when I know the inevitable could be happening, and it would please me, it'd be so neat.
Age crept up on the Allistons. Sturdy little Eleanor slowly succumbed to dementia. John cared for her until she died, writing books on naval history in his spare time.
Thank you.
We never dared ask him if he had laid her to rest on the compost heap, as she told me that he had promised.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's been a wonderful time for me.
After a lifetime living together on Three Hummock Island, a solitary John passed away, having spent his final years in a retirement home on the mainland.
Oh, well, that was lovely.
Really was beautiful.
Those faraway places with strange sounding names. Holland, Holland, me.
I've just arrived home to find my study and the storerooms where I keep my archive under 6 inches of gurgling water, a burst pipe. So now I'm struggling to rescue and dry out 50 years of sodden history, the photographic files and tapes of every Whicker's world since 1957, the moist remnants of a life's work that was splashing around and sinking. Looking at this shambles, I can see and remember the implacable chill of the Great Wall of China, the impatience while waiting for the Sultan of Brunei, the unexpected arrival of that blonde who carried her harp around Paraguay. Memories have been floating about and reminding me that even the happiest of lives has its surprises. It's like watching your past life flashing before you without actually needing to drown.